Miscoll with EMS Now, and welcome to this edition of the virtual Eric Miscoll Show. As always, I have the man from down under, not Crocodile Dundee, but Philip Stoten joining us today. Thank you, Philip.
Welcome.
Our focus today is getting an update on what's happening over in China in the electronics manufacturing industry. So we've invited some colleagues who happen to reside over there to give us some updates. So joining us today, we have Carl Hung, President and CEO of Season Group, the EMS company, and also CEO of SG Wireless. And we have Mark Rinehart, founder and managing director of White Horse Laboratories. So gentlemen, thank you for joining us today and your willingness to participate and go through this with us. So let's begin by allowing you each to introduce yourself and your organizations for the benefit of our audience. And Carl, why don't we start with you, sir?
Well, thank you, Eric, and thank you, Crocodile Dundee, for inviting me on today. Season Group is a EMS provider with facilities in China, Malaysia, Mexico, and the UK. And for us, we're vertically integrated with capabilities in injection molding, cables, and turnkey box build. And also, we're heavily involved in the development and design of IoT devices, which is our SG Wireless division.
Excellent. And Mark?
Eric, thank you for having us this morning. My name is Mark Rinehart. I'm the founder and managing director here at White Horse Laboratories. We're an electronics testing lab, so we focus on life cycle and reliability testing, counterfeit detection for components, design for manufacturing support, failure analysis as well, and also factory auditing, primarily supporting the electronics manufacturing industry, obviously. We're based here to be as close to the supply chain as possible.
Excellent, thank you. Before we get into all the nitty gritty about the industry, let's start with kind of the big topic. We spoke last year a lot, and we always asked our guests for the update on how they're handling the pandemic currently, and we were hoping not to have to ask that again here this year, but we find ourselves. So let me just ask, kind of, what is the current situation over there in Hong Kong and China in terms of both the pandemic, how's that going, and also in terms of the vaccines that are being made available? And Carl, why don't I go to you first, sir?
Yeah, in Hong Kong right now, we are slowing down from our fourth phase, which we entered in November. I think yesterday's numbers were 12 cases that were positive. And so that's a good thing, where the Hong Kong government's decided to roll back the social distancing measures. So we're actually allowed to go for dinner until 10 p.m. now, which is welcome relief. And it's going to be mandatory testing for all restaurant workers and store managers, et cetera. So in Hong Kong, it seems like it's turning a leaf now. So that's a good thing. In Dongguan, we're also seeing, actually, we've had quite relaxed measures down there already. From what I know, no one has been really wearing masks out in public anymore anyways, out in the open, at least. They only wear it when they're indoors. I know for school children, they'll wear it into the schools, but then once they're in the classrooms, they take it off as well too. And also in certain cities, from what I hear, they've already started mandatory vaccinations as well too. Over in Dongguan, they have made it mandatory for all those who interact with cross-border trucks to have the vaccination. So in our factory, we've had 10 people vaccinated already. Yeah.
Okay.
Mark, what are you seeing?
Yeah, from the other side of the bridge, it's very much similar here. Overall, the use of personal protective equipment, so masks as well as sanitization, that's continued throughout. Different areas in Shenzhen, it's slightly different. In Shekou on the west side of the city, very rare to see people wearing masks outdoors, but here in Futian and throughout majority of Shenzhen, everybody's still wearing full PPE. I think fortunately the scares that we had about the new strains that had entered before Chinese New Year and were spreading around, those did not eventuate. Again, I think the lockdown measures here, or at least they're not lockdown measures anymore, but the precautions that are taken when a case is identified, the tracing is very fast. The quarantines are very effective. So those cases seem to be snuffed out fairly quickly. So the concerns we had before Chinese New Year, fortunately, so far, have not eventuated, which has been it's very positive. So we think we've dodged that bullet. There was a lot of concern about the travel at Chinese New Year and talk about restricted travel during the Chinese New Year holiday. Don't think much of that actually eventuated. We had restrictions, like we couldn't have our annual dinner, which is usually a large gathering, and we weren't allowed to do that. We didn't argue about it because we all wanted to stay safe. In terms of vaccinations, the vaccinations like Hong Kong, I think we're targeting the healthcare workers and front of line. So teachers, taxi drivers, bus drivers, those people that have direct contact with unknown. It's not particularly being targeted or emphasized to the seniors. I think they're staying a little bit safer than being out. And what's interesting is the large factories, like you talk factories with thousands of employees, they aren't prioritized for vaccination, but they're providing on-site testing. So rather than using what little vaccine is still available for these large populated factories, they are just doing on-site testing and then sending anybody home or quarantining anybody that tests positive. So I found that quite interesting because that can spread like brush fire in those very highly populated or densely populated factories. But they are providing on-site testing for those facilities. So knock on wood, fortunately, we've still maintained, been able to stay safe here.
Yeah, relatively no numbers. I think it's really interesting. The whole thing's become a complex system, hasn't it? Systems of quarantine, systems of, testing. As you mentioned, the contact tracing is huge. The speed at which you can contact trace is a big deal. We're just coming out of down here in Melbourne, we're just coming out of a 5-day snap lockdown. And the process of contact tracing has been really good, but that's because the numbers are relatively low. So we're contact tracing around, single digit numbers of live cases, and we're getting out and testing as many people as we can. And there seem to be some some faster testing processes coming along. So I think that's going to help. Vaccination's going to help when we get the quarantine process and quarantine hotels properly locked down. I think that's going to help. They're already talking about provisioning an old airport here and building a specific facility. So interesting stuff. What I think is really interesting, though, is you've got this on top of Chinese New Year. Eric's in the frozen tundra of Texas right now. We just seem to be in a position where it's one disruption upon another. I think COVID taught us to deal with, or accelerated the way we put in systems to deal with disruption. That's just becoming a fact of life for everybody's business now, isn't it? You've got to be prepared for the next disruption. You've got to be prepared for whatever comes along, whether it's a power outage or it's a pandemic. Carl, how do you change your internal systems to kind of make you more agile, make you more resilient, make you ready for the next disruption? Because customers don't want to be switched off every time there's a storm or there's a challenge.
Yeah, I think COVID has created everyone to for the very first time ever, use the business continuity plan that we've all stored in our ISO manuals all along and actually use it, where you've got a Rolodex of contacts you need to use at any given time. So our factory in Reynosa, like Eric, was under snow and power outages as well too. So people couldn't get to work, etc. During COVID, early stages, we provided we provide transportation for all of our workers. So we had that contact in place already to pick up people for the last 2 days or so to get them to work as such. So that helped us continue production as well as our contact ability. We've established the digital networks to stay in communication and keep all of our workers informed. So in China, it'd be WeChat. In other areas, it'd be either Teams or WhatsApp. So all of us are very well informed, and generally speaking, you'll know exactly where each of our colleagues are. There's not much missing information in there, so that's a good thing. Because the last thing we want to know is someone passing away because of the cold or whatnot.
Yeah.
But I think we're much better connected with our
Yeah.
team as a result.
Yeah. And Mark, is that the same for you guys? Have you pulled out that dusty old continuity plan and started using it as a part of everyday business?
Yeah, we had that contingency plan, and then there's like, oh, okay, there was a couple contingencies we hadn't planned on.
Yeah.
So we've certainly enhanced that. By and large, it's a good thing. The same thing we've been, as Carl was mentioning, we use our attendance system, which is usually for clocking in directly on site. It can be used for remote, and we use that as a communication tool. Like during last year's lockdown, people were even posting their temperature 3 times a day. So we were monitoring who was in what condition. That certainly, and we've just maintained that throughout. For people that were traveling during Chinese New Year this year, we requested them to notify us where they were going so we could monitor if any place had become a high risk area, and then require them to be tested, if not quarantined, upon return to Shenzhen. But we were able to keep track of everybody, and everybody's very willing to communicate with that. No one saw that as a breach of privacy. They just saw it as a necessary safety protocol. Yeah. As we do always throughout Chinese New Year, we do have staff that are on duty, but we have more contingency plans and people wearing a few different hats when necessary to maintain the server, because we can't keep IT on at all times. So we've done a little bit more cross training. So we've got people that are ready to step up for emergency situations. And in Hong Kong, even, we've worked with some temp agencies to provide some very critical but basic training, so that if we are short staffed for any reason, we can move our experienced staff into the critical areas and have some temps come in and even fill in like the basic for receiving, getting product in and identified so we can get into the processing with our experienced team. So we've worked with some temp agencies to be able to fill any capacity gaps, short-term capacity gaps. So again, I think same thing, mainly is communication and having contingency plans in for if somebody isn't able to come in.
Yeah,
or be available.
Adding on that, I think very common now in China and Hong Kong is the concept of A/B teams. So you'll never have a full team in the office. You'll have an A team and a B team. So if, knock on wood, someone is out from the A team, the B team will still operate, and it won't be all from one department. It'll be multiple departments.
Yeah, and it is part of that, having everybody connected digitally. You know, is that something we've learned through this whole COVID experience, that the more connectivity we've got between everybody and the more data we've got, the easier it is to be resilient, to be adaptable?
I think the communication, the connecting has been critical. I think everybody's been very willing to share that information. Data in terms of location and health status. Certainly we notice that people are putting in much earlier notice if they think there might be a family issue that they may not be able to be in next Tuesday, for example. They're letting us know farther in advance so that we can make contingency plans. In terms of data, we're not tracking too heavily because we don't want to infringe on people's privacy, but they have been willing to share like location and where they're going, that sort of thing. And they even have contact tracing. Here in Shenzhen, if they have a COVID test and they test negative, it's on their app. And when they scan the QR code, we see that they've already been tested and have tested negative. So that stuff people are willing to share quite openly. And that's been healthy to see. And it's also been good to see that we're not taking it too far.
Yeah, so hugely valuable.
Let's go back to the Chinese New Year issue. It happens every year. It's kind of disruptive. People pre-plan for it, or they think they do, right? And it's always a disruption within the supply chain that has to be factored in, right? So how is it different this year, the year of the ox? Does it feel different? Did people do the pre-planning? Carl, was it kind of business as usual from last year, or is it different this year?
It's very different this year. for us, we were recommended by our local authorities to incentivize people to stay in the local region because they didn't want the millions of people to travel across the country. So we made a lot of incentives for our workers to stay, and approximately 40% of our workers remained in the factory. So that was good, and we were very lucky as well too. It seems business has returned a bit to normal now. So actually, for them to remain in the factory has been good for us in that we can continue production throughout Chinese New Year's. So actually, our CNY days off this year, I think we were off on Friday, Monday, Tuesday, but we'll be back on work today. So only 3 days officially off. Shorter time frame, people working and getting more OT pay as a result. So it's been managed very well, I would say. Overall wise, the central government and the local governments, and working with the local business as well to keep people safe, working as opposed to traveling throughout. And also it's the reason why it's created a massive boom in the restaurant industry over here in China. And also from what I heard, the movie cinemas, it's blowing up right now. IMAX China, the shares went through the roof yesterday because it's record numbers of people watching movies over CNY because there's nothing else to do. It's either eat or watch movies.
Wow. Mark, what are you seeing on that front? How is it this year?
We were expecting, again, with the restrictions that were coming down before leading into Chinese New Year, we were expecting that there would be far less travel than there normally was, and there certainly was far less travel than usual. It still ended up being quite a few people traveling, but probably more local. I think throughout the outbreak, since international travel is not possible, the domestic tourism sites are absolutely booming. Even some of the hiking trails here in Shenzhen on Chinese New Year Day, the videos of, I mean, literally a hiking trail that was nonstop people for 2.5 hours, basically standing still on a hiking trail.
Wow.
And I think the same thing's happening with the cinemas. The people can't travel. Usually we go to Thailand or something else, though those options aren't available. So the domestic stuff, even inner city with the movie cinemas, are absolutely booming. We personally, in terms of White Horse, we're seeing less of a disruption in terms of fewer people leaving early and fewer people coming back late. The supplier base, though, really wasn't affected. The supplier base here was closing down on the 5th. So a good 5 days before Chinese New Year, they had closed. I mean, they made their last shipments in the morning and they were gone. And we still had people until 10, 12 o'clock at night to make sure that those things were tested and shipped before we couldn't get anything out. So it turned out we were actually able to leave, let people go a little bit early on the last day because we'd already finished everything, which is kind of uncommon. We're usually carrying stuff to the couriers the last minute. But overall, I think there was domestically less travel. I think overall there's going to be less disruption in terms of the amount of time that factories are closed. As Carl was mentioning, I think there's been that window where there's absolutely nothing going on is tighter this year. And overall, I think that's quite healthy. Again, it's less disruption this year.
Yeah. Speaking of disruptions, the next disruption that seems to be coming down is component shortages. I'm hearing from EMS companies in the US, in Europe, that they're challenged by component shortages, and there's concerns of longer lead times. What are you guys hearing on that? Mark, are you, is that impacting you as yet?
Absolutely. It's been impacting us for several months. I think it started really last year, just because there was limited, I mean, warehouses were closed and stuff couldn't move around. But in terms of actual lack of production supply, I think that started being visible last year and the Q4 of last year. It's predicted, and it's getting to be now like COVID testing. Anything regarding component testing that we track is all about component shortages. It's currently predicted to last into Q3 of this year. I think that's optimistic. I think as hopefully as the quarantines and the vaccinations take place, more people will be back to work regularly. That's going to increase demand, and it's a pent up demand. That's going to lead further to the shortages. I think the policies that were in place in the last year and a half have certainly supported the shortage process by disallowing some manufacturers like SMC. The Chinese foundry has been pretty much off limits. So that demand was focused more towards the remaining foundries, which caused, I mean, shortage are based that we can't even get enough wafers. And that's not a problem you can solve overnight. You can't just put them on overtime and crank out new, make new ingots overnight. It takes a while to get those facilities up and running. So before the wafers even get to the component manufacturers, there's so much further downstream that's been disrupted that it's going to take a long time to get out of this.
Is that a hangover from COVID or a hangover from tariffs, or kind of all of the above and something that was kind of
inevitable? I think it's a perfect storm. I think it's a bit of everything.
Yeah. Carl, what does that mean for you guys? Can't get components, can't build boards.
Well, first off, I get a lot more emails from brokers asking about our E&O list. They all want to buy whatever we have, so that's a good thing as well. It's a good time for EMS providers to sell E&O. So I think Mark will see a lot more business of people verifying these decades-old components, see if they still work or not. So that's one thing we're optimistic about. But overall wise, like Mark said, we start seeing it last year as well too. I think from our distributors, they're saying that the book-bill ratios they've seen so far in Q4 of last year, they were at around 1.8, whereas during 2017, book-bill ratio was 1.3. So they're seeing that this cycle will be a lot worse than the MLCC capacitor issue back in 2017, 2018. And this is across the board, MLCC capacitors, resistors, ICs, PCBs, and resins. All that being affected. So I think the key thing right now is everyone knows about it. So that's a good thing. We're communicating with our customers, telling them it's probably a good thing for you to place POs earlier so that we can actually secure orders for you. So our book-bill ratio has actually been very, very healthy so far. So that's the upside. Second, this issue is executing on these orders. That will be the concern because everyone, we're seeing a lot of people canceling on orders. Even if existing orders, they'll raise prices on you and then tell you if you don't agree to these prices, cancel
the order.
And then so the secondhand market will get more active in that sense. Again, it's a good place for Mark to be in. More business.
And I was going to ask you. I was going to ask you about that, Mark. You're going to be busier, but these periods of shortages, they put all kinds of risk in the supply chain, all kind of risk in the market. You're looking at components finding their way through gray channels, I guess, and you're looking at counterfeiters thinking this is an opportunity to, to cash in. How does that look, and how do you combat that?
Well, times like this, I refer to as like the chum is in the water and the sharks are circling. It's not good. Everything from particularly in high rail industries right now, like automotive and medical, they require higher grade components with higher temperature grades. And people would just slap a label on something or remark something as a commercial, as an industrial device. And that becomes very prevalent at times like this. It requires a higher level of testing to be able to do so at temperature range, which we certainly can do. But we think the OEMs need to get more involved in this process. They tend to rely on their suppliers to do what's necessary, and they really need to be dictating what needs to be done. There are standards in place, and they just need to be enforcing that this needs to be a soft termination capacitor for a high stress environment like automotive, or it needs to be the temperature grade needs to be verified before the product is used. I think the OEMs need to stay involved in that process to make sure that the right verification processes are being done. I think that's the critical part. I mean, there is excess and obsolete inventory that is available, but it's not necessarily everything that's required on your BOM list. So if it's too good to be true, it probably is, and verify if you really are desperate. But the verification process is critical, and we just hope the OEMs and EMS are more involved in that process.
Yeah, and when you look at that, who do you think really should be owning that? Should it be, does it really start at the OEM, or is it more, are you going to push the responsibility onto Carl and the EMS industry, or is it the component distributors, or is it all of the above, and there has to be kind of collaboration and, you know, standards that are seamless between all of them?
Well, that sounds pretty ideal, though. The last statement you made, that sounds fabulous. I think it's going to take a while to get to that. But again, as people are looking at more supply chain, overall health of a supply chain and risk mitigation, I think that's something that people are getting to, probably more faster now than they had in the past. The EMS probably sees it firsthand because they're the ones that are knowing, all right, we do not have enough components to fill your order. These are our options, Mr. OEM or Mrs. OEM, sorry. But these are the options you have. We can stop production. There are alternate products available, but they need to be verified. And there are product available, but it's from an unknown source. So we would need to test it to verify. It's your product. You have the choice. What do you want to do?
Yeah.
So I think the EMS definitely has to communicate the shortage status, because there certainly is a pressure to produce. But again, I think communication is the key there, and the OEM ultimately should have the decision because it's their product.
Yeah, it's that centrality.
How are those conversations going, Carl?
Lucky for us, customers are receptive. I think everyone hears on the news about these situations. So you tell them that Murata is out, they'll very easily move to Yagyu, much more open to these alternatives than before, because it's very prevalent. Like, I think the good thing about the whole Redditor GameStop movement was that it caused people to realize that actually people are speculating on a lot of the stuff too. So silver, copper, tin, resin, oil, it's being controlled by Redditors. So you have to be ready for it at any given time. And so I think the ability to use alternatives and expand the AVL is much greater now than before.
Yeah, and maybe 2020 taught everybody that when you're designing a product, you need to not have single sources in your supply chain. So I think there's, maybe a fundamental learning there. Yeah,
and well, they realized finally that the factory that makes the Murata resistors is the exact same factory that makes non-Murata resistors. So
and maybe
by that factory stuff.
And calls them Murata anyway.
and maybe if they were two separate factories, they'd still be supplied by the same person next tier down the supply chain. So we all know supply chain's complicated, and you've got to be working layers down.
Yeah.
But even before the pandemic, there was talk within the component industry that there was simply not sufficient capacity in place prior to it, and that had to be addressed. And then we hit pandemic, and everybody had to deal with that. That issue still exists and still has to be managed. And the willingness to create and spend on new capacity is a challenge, I think, for the industry that they need to work out of still.
Yeah, like I think from that component industry standpoint, or even PCB standpoint, what's my incentive to actually expand capacity right now? I'm getting better margins than ever before, so why bother? I'll nickel for all I got. It's natural.
No, it's a challenge. So go, Eric.
Well,
it's your show.
I was going to shift gears here a bit and talk about, one of the trends that's been going on over the last year is certainly the whole reshoring, right?
Yeah.
We've heard a lot about, and we've talked about that previously within this group. So, so what are you seeing in that regard? Is there, is it more talk than action right now? Is it just, I mean, it always happens during a political season here in the United States. Every 4 years, it's predictable, right? Whoever was running, they always say, we got to bring manufacturing back, the election
in America,
move on to something else. But it seems different this year. What are you experiencing over there? And Carl, maybe I'll start with you. You're dealing with this on a global basis too, because of your facilities. So
I think one of the premise that Biden ran on was he'll really bring back Buy American programs. And the odd thing was after announcing that, he immediately calls up Justin Trudeau over in Canada and says, "It doesn't apply to you guys. You're okay." Like, oh, but Canada's not part of the Americans. So I think there's a lot of superficial discussions involved.
Yeah.
They talk about Buy American, but maybe what they mean is Buy North American. So from that standpoint, it's benefited, I think, Canada and Mexico more so than American producers, whereby we had to shut down our San Antonio facility last year because all the components and PCBs that we brought into the country, we'd have to pay the 15 to 25% tariff on top of the American salary wages, which is now being talked about adding up to minimum wage of $15 per hour. So I think from the reshoring standpoint, I think there will be reshoring, but it's not necessarily to the US itself. It will be to either Canada or Mexico, where I think even Canada is a great option because of the low dollar conversions and low minimum wage and lower cost of living as well too. So we're seeing that where most of our new business expansion is in Mexico, more so than Malaysia, which is another option of non-China manufacturing.
Yeah. Is it China plus one that people are looking at as they look to kind of maybe reduce a bit of their dependency on a China only strategy? Is it, what's my big support option to China? I'm not throwing China out. I'm just adding a bit of diversity in there.
Yeah, I think for the China plus one strategy, it has to be programs of certain sizes. Those are the customers that are open to it right now. So generally speaking, that what we're seeing is any program of around $3 or $5 million US, then they'll consider, oh, let's split that half-half. But if you're talking about $1 million program, they can't afford the NREs. So they'll usually say, oh, let's just move it to Malaysia or Mexico itself. But the odd thing is the supply chain is all still from China. So I think the benefit for them is that the cash conversion cycle is much better because it's not them putting everything on the boat, it's us putting things on the boat to Mexico. So I think that they're thinking in that realm as well.
Yeah. What do you see, Mark?
We see more of a regionalization than a reshoring, bringing it closer to home, but not necessarily to home. Carl made a very interesting point that we keep thinking about is, right, if you want us to produce in the United States, but the components aren't made in the US. So in order to manufacture the end product here, you need to get rid of this tariff on the components I need to produce, because then I'm no longer competitive with Mexico or Europe or anywhere else. That tariff is eliminating the advantage of reshoring in that specifically, so that it ends up more of a regionalized thing, because a component that's on a product that's imported from Mexico is not tariffed, but the component itself is tariffed if you bring it into the US. So that's eliminating some of that reshoring capability. We've seen more regionalization. I think there was already talk, not political, just pure cost basis. China's costs have continued to escalate for years. This is not anything new. And the shift of manufacturing from very commodity type objects to lower cost manufacturing centers has been ongoing. I think in the EMS world and electronic manufacturing, that shift was to Malaysia first because there was already existing capacity there. So you're basically turning back on lines that hadn't been there. So you just had to increase your staffing levels, but you didn't have to produce new facilities. And Vietnam then was the hot topic last year. Everything was going to Vietnam. Everything's going to Vietnam. I think there's been some realization that the ceiling in terms of the capacity ceiling in Vietnam is fairly low because their population isn't that high. We're seeing, again, we continue to hear about Malaysia and production shifting there. Indonesia is coming up as a manufacturing center. There's been a huge shift, and the conversation now is all about India and OEMs pushing manufacturing to India, even if there may not be suppliers there yet. They're telling people, right, you need to manufacture this in India without much consideration for, is the supply chain there? Is the infrastructure there to even support it? So there's certainly a lot of talk. I think the shortages have restricted that. There's a lot of things, like our inability to travel and to set up new facilities has been restricted. And right now with the shortages going on, you really can't afford another disruption of splitting your manufacturing and turning another facility on. It takes time to do that. And if you don't have components to do it, you can't ramp them up, and you can't afford the drop in production output while you're shifting manufacturing to another place. So again, I think there's a lot of talk, but the process of it happening is fairly slow at the moment.
Yeah, I read a survey from, I think it was from Gartner, but it might have been IDC. Apologies to whoever it wasn't. That something like 55% of people were considering shifting their supply chain, and something like 4% of people had actually done something about it. So the gap between thinking about it and doing it is pretty substantial. And Carl, you said that, sometimes that's just a realization that it's not practical. You've got $750,000 worth of business. Makes sense for that to sit on one line in one factory, not spread over two different continents. And I think the discussion about India is fascinating, because India's been the next China for, I reckon, for 20 years, as long as I can remember, and it hasn't got there. And there are lots of reasons in terms of red tape, in terms of logistics. There's lots of things that China has been able to do that India hasn't been able to do. So I'm kind of curious how realistic that is. I guess one of the benefits that India has, which is the same as China, is it has a domestic consumption. So if you're building a product for India, it makes perfect sense to build it there. But as the factory of the world, I'm kind of unsure. You mentioned the US. Are you hearing much about reshoring to Europe, Carl? Is there more demand for work to go into your UK facility, for example?
Unfortunately, UK is not part of the EU anymore, so we're not seeing the benefit of that. But I talked to Dieter Weiss about months ago, and then he mentioned the massive reshoring activities into Eastern Europe for sure, and which is why for the past 4 years we've always been looking for an Eastern European solution to add to our platform, but just haven't found one yet.
Well,
it's interesting. I think, Mark, the way you caged was good. I mean, we're asking about reshoring, which always strikes me as a political initiative, right? Whereas what you mentioned was the regionalization, build in region for region, I think is the sensible strategy, right? It doesn't, and all regions can benefit from that, depending on where your end customers are. And each region has its low cost areas still, right? So there is a benefit to that. But I guess this time around, I guess my question is what's been driving this? Has it been, is it because people got smarter about doing total cost of outsourcing analysis? Is it because some political backlash that's happened with China, with the previous administration? What do you think's at the root of it there? And Carl, I'll come to you first, if you don't mind.
Wow. Okay. I was hoping you'd go to Mark first. So it gives me time to actually think of an answer.
Well, I've got a comment there to give you a chance to think, Carl. I think you're now in a position where, and Carl's in this position, you've got to have a global footprint. You've got to have the ability to make in multiple regions to be taken seriously by a global OEM. And I think people have just got a bit smarter, not just on the total cost of ownership or total cost of outsourcing, but they've got a bit smarter on terms of agility and resilience and the importance of those things and why they need to do that. And then I think it plays to the importance that companies like Carl's then set up a system where they have got similar MES systems around the world. They've got similar, test and verification facilities. They've got the ability to switch a product from one geography to another. And if they've done the NPI, in Malaysia, they should be able to cut out a lot of those NPI steps in Mexico. And if they can do that, you've got the ability to provide a really good regional solution. What do you think, Carl? Does that make sense? Is that another utopian vision?
That would be amazing, for sure. And that's what we're doing actually as well too, because what we're seeing right now, like Mark mentioned, labor costs in China has gone up a lot. for sure, compared to the likes of Malaysia, Vietnam, etc. Where I think our China facility is higher than our Mexico and Malaysia costs right now. But labor itself only accounts for 5% of a finished good price. It's minimal. So what might be a 10% difference is overall 0.5% to the BOM cost. At the end of the day, it's still a supply chain material cost that drives the whole engine. You're talking 70 to 80% of a finished good cost. So if you take into consideration the shipping cost, for example, containers, what was it, a month ago, a cost of container went up, I think it was 10 times. The cost to go from Hong Kong to the UK to Hong Kong. So it actually caused a shortage of fries for McDonald's at one point. So that, because shipping costs accounts for maybe 0.5 to 1.5% of a finished good cost. So overall wise, labor itself isn't the main driver really. It's shipping is the cost of material, and also engineering and MOH, SG&A, engineering cost, where still today, China has a very competitive engineering cost rates, except for Shenzhen, I'd say. I think over in Dongguan, people are still very reasonably priced compared to the rest of the world. So if you can control those cost factors, China can still be very competitive because it controls most of the cost in that sense. So for us, we're trying to make use of that cost benefit, hire more people in China to do the NPIs, to use the local supply chain. And then once the product is in mass production, then we will take the onus of moving over to Malaysia and Mexico using the likes of MES and also just pure webcams, Microsoft Teams, all of that to conduct the transfer. You don't necessarily have to be on site to actually inspect the plastic sample to make sure that the shine is proper or the A surface is great. You can do it much more virtually now.
No, it's impressive that you've done that. And who'd have thought, Carl, that chip shortages would be French fries? But that's a surprise to all of us. What about that thing of, you know, skills and hiring people and talent and the cost of labor? What do you see in Mark in terms of labor rates going up in Shenzhen and Hong Kong, and actually just being able to recruit the talent that you need?
I think it's becoming it has been a shortage for a while. I think some of that is in Shenzhen, it used to be much easier. I think the cost of living in Shenzhen has driven the increase in labor costs. Just, so much of it is real estate driven here, that the rents and property prices are so high that the salaries that people require, and I'm not even gonna say demand, the salaries that they require to be able to afford rent, are so much higher now that it's really driven the labor cost up. So there are certainly, and it's harder to get people to come here because the cost of living here is so much higher. So I think that's contributed to Shenzhen's kind of as a manufacturing base. That's really gone away. I mean, Dongguan is probably the closest to Shenzhen that exists for a manufacturing base. A lot of that has moved. What's here is the high tech, like R&D. The domestic manufacturers, OEMs, have R&D facilities here, and that's a completely different structure than manufacturing in terms of costs that they're putting into it. I think that's been some of the restriction. When you look at regionalization, some of the restriction on moving to Vietnam, for example, is there's a lack of a leadership or management talent base, not necessarily a personality profile, but there's just not that availability of talent. And currently with the travel restrictions, you can't shift managers from here to there to support temporarily to bring them up, or at least the quarantine period makes that difficult. And I think then it becomes the ongoing question of, all right, if you're going to regionalize, what's the talent base already there, or do you have to develop it? China, that's already been done for the last 20 years. I mean, we've spoken about the structure of constructing the supply chain around manufacturing, and a lot of that was developing the talent. When manufacturing moved here, there was people to wind the cores, but there was not people to manage that process and to manage purchasing and procurement and production planning. all that was brought or developed.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of time to do that. And I think that's a component some people are overlooking when they talk about, we'll just move it from here to there. It's not just the capacity to make the stuff, it's the availability of management talent and engineering talent and all the other professions that are required to make a facility run correctly. I think that might be being overlooked in the rush to reshore and regionalize, in that, do you have the resources there to support it?
Yeah.
Not just the material resources, but the human resources.
Yeah. And just before we wrap up on this whole kind of geography thing, when you look at China, you look at Shenzhen and you look at the Shanghai region, higher labor costs, growing costs there. There's a whole lot more of China, as well as Vietnam and Malaysia and all those other places. What are you seeing in terms of new regions of China developing? Are there opportunities there for expansion, lower cost labor, that kind of thing? Carl?
Well, certainly the low-cost region in China was Xinjiang, but it's been blacklisted by all countries naturally. So I think low cost isn't what China is going to be known for moving forward. I think China is mostly innovation and engineering, where certainly I think kids over here nowadays, they see the likes of TikTok, they see the likes of a Show, and all of them, they want to be engineers. Like, I mean, we have 1.3 billion people in this country, and everyone is driven, let's go into tech, let's go into computer science, where I think other countries don't have that push that we do in China. So I think moving forward, you'll see a lot more innovation coming from this country instead of just the low cost side of things.
And we're seeing Shenzhen become a bit of a Silicon Valley of Asia. So I think there's a real shift there.
What do you see here for, when Chinese New Year's ends? What are you seeing happening in China as we move forward throughout this year? What are the trends that are happening? What's going to continue to drive the market there?
Well, we return from Chinese New Year tomorrow. That's the official end of first day of work after Chinese New Year. It's also the 1-year anniversary of when we were able to return to work following last year's lockdown. So I think the first thing I'm going to do is be standing in the hallway with pom-poms, being the cheerleader that we're actually able to reopen on schedule this year, 1 year to the day that we were able to go back to work last year. So it's a pretty momentous day, I would say, tomorrow. But I think we're going to continue focusing on the longer term development plan. I think China overall, like you mentioned, Shenzhen has become a development hub, the commodity-based manufacturing factory to the world. I think that's already shifting on for several reasons, and China's focusing in the higher density population areas like Shenzhen and Shanghai, Chengdu as well, are focusing on higher level products. OEM-based development and R&D, like Carl was mentioning. I think that's going to continue at an accelerated pace here. You can kind of follow Foxconn in terms of their trajectory of their initial manufacturing base, where they went for lower cost, and then what they are doing. They've moved R&D. R&D is still very largely based here with ZTE and Huawei as well. I think that's the model going forward. And they're also probably looking at regionalized manufacturing for where they can produce some of their commodity-based products less expensively. I don't think it's going to hurt. I mean, this shift of manufacturing there's not a huge shift out of China, particularly as the domestic base, population base, consumer base, and the OEM base is going higher upstream. There's a lot of domestic demand and there's a lot of domestic supply. It's not hurting the EMS industry, maybe internationally, but domestically, it's very robust.
From my side, it's definitely a short-term focus for us only, right after Chinese New Year's. A lot of escalation calls, talking to customers, talking to suppliers, trying to get components. That's one end. Other side of things is labor, especially in China. Population 1.3 billion people, and there's a shortage of labor. Every year we have this issue, but I think this year will be even more so because people either didn't leave or they did go back and they can't come back because there's long quarantine periods. I'm going up to China on Friday, and I'm expected to spend 21 days in quarantine. I don't think a lot of our workers want to do the 21 days either themselves. So they'll probably stay at home waiting for the quarantine periods to pass. So there'll be a bigger fight for labor. So it's Q1 will just trying to get products out the door because the market is back. It's hot, and we just need to be able to supply the demand.
Yeah, that's interesting. You say that, Carl. That's what I hear when I talk to more and more EMS customers. We sit between us and we talk about all these dynamics that are putting us under pressure. But the OEMs are just like, ship my product. I want my product. You know, these are all fascinating stories, guys. But you know, when can I get my product? When can I ramp my volume? And there seems to be plenty going on there. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to mention that Carl is always in my favorite Hong Kong art gallery. The artwork behind him, done by his kids, is always awesome.
It's all for sale, by the way.
It's all for sale, is it? Big prices. Private viewings. There you go. So contact Carl if you need EMS services or some locally made art.
Very good. Yeah, and I have to apologize. I look like I'm, winter is coming here, and it's game of.
Well, it's already come, hasn't it? You are in the frozen tundra.
We are in the frozen tundra, and if there were crows flying around, it would really kind of finish the.
You're in a Hitchcock movie.
I've noticed I've gotten darker as it's gone, but that's because, power is. Who would think that in Texas, the largest energy producer in the country, in the United States, we're having energy issues. So,
but Eric, is that going to cause a run on toilet paper again?
You joke, but it probably will. Yeah. We're not going above freezing until the end of the week. So, and the roads, it turns to ice here, right? Everybody thinks it's cute in the snow, but then it turns to ice and it gets real treacherous. So
I saw that. That was horrible.
The good news is we're doing our own imposed lockdown right now, as Phil had to do there. It's the weather, Mother Nature is forcing this on us.
Yeah, it's cold. Stay home.
Yeah, but listen, gentlemen, we have to wrap. But I just want to take this opportunity to thank you both, Carl and Mark, for taking the time and sharing with our audience your insights on what's happening over there. It's always appreciated. I think you guys are a good voice for both sides of the bridge, so as you indicated. And I have to say, Carl, I loved your comment that you're expected to stay in 21-day lockdown. There wasn't a commitment there that I picked up on. I heard an expectation is set, but yeah, and I'm just teasing.
Yeah,
but
people are listening.
Thank you both for taking the time. To the audience, if you need some updates on what's happening over in China, if you need EMS or the Mark services of White Horse Lab, the component testing, by all means, reach out to them. They can both be found on LinkedIn. They're both quite active there. And as I always say, if you can't get a hold of them there, get a hold of me and I'll try my best to put you in touch. So, gentlemen, again, thank you. Phil, always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure.
Stay safe. I wish you a good year.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Bye.